Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Maggie Howell, and I'm the director of the Wolf Conservation Center. Just a few things before we get started tonight. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in the control panel. It should be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll provide time for questions at the end of Dr. Spanjol's talk. Also, a recorded version of the webinar will be available on the Wolf Conservation Center website within a day or two. Okay, so today we're joined by Dr. Kim Spanjol, who has generously offered her time to discuss wildlife crime beyond what might be our typical notions of it, so to include broader considerations of interconnected social harms that impact wildlife. Dr. Spanjol is a criminologist, licensed doctoral level board certified behavior analyst, licensed mental health counselor, and certified humane educator. She holds certifications in animal and human health, animal-assisted interventions, and teaching mindfulness to youth. Dr. Spanjol is an educator, researcher, consultant, and clinician, currently serving as a professor of criminal justice and sociology at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. She teaches courses in environmental crime, environmental justice, species justice, and more. Dr. Spanjol's area of specialization are behavior modification for individual and system level change, cognitive behavior therapy and social emotional learning, humane education and the intersectionality of social justice, ethical animal assisted therapy and the human animal bond, animals and crime justice, and environmental criminology. Whew. That was a mouthful. Well, I'm really excited to get started. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Kim Spanjol. Hey, Kim.
Hi. Thanks so much, Maggie, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for joining us here tonight. I just want to say that in my position at Iona College, where I teach, I have had the pleasure of having speakers from Wolf Conservation Center come and speak to my students. And we've also worked together and volunteered at the Wolf Conservation Center. So I'm really happy to be able to share some of these ideas with everyone. Hopefully they won't be too academic and boring. I'm trying really hard to keep it engaging. And that said, I did include some extra information on the slides, including some videos that I typically would share that I won't be sharing tonight in the interest of time, but this will be available to you if you choose to look at them later. So that said, we are going to be talking about wildlife crime in an expanded conception of that. And I think that on the first slide, that encompasses what we're going to be looking at tonight when we look at an ego versus an eco view of wildlife crime, where we can either envision ourselves as humans on the top of a structure where all other animals are beneath us, or we can look at ourselves as part of an interconnected web. And we will be looking at how laws and enforcement of laws are shaped by those views. So that said, okay, there we go. In terms of the webinar description, I know that you've seen that already. So I'm going to jump right into talking about the definition of wildlife crime. And if we look at the definition of wildlife crime, they are acts that are committed contrary to national laws and regulations that are intended to protect natural resources and to administer their management and use. And I highlighted the words protect and use because I think that that is always the kind of balance when we're looking at crime, wildlife crime, and there are some victims of wildlife crime on the slide, and that can include illicit exploitation of what's considered natural resources through poaching or illegal logging, and processing of fauna and flora into products, and their transportation or offer for sale, sale and possession. The concealment and laundering of the financial benefits made out of those crimes, and also violations of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which is CITES, which I will talk about a little bit more as we go on. When we talk about combating wildlife crime, there's typically a focus on the producers and suppliers and consumers in the illegal wildlife trade. and the security implications of the trade. There are links to organized crime, terrorism, drug, weapons, and human trafficking. In fact, illegal trafficking of wildlife and wildlife parts is the 4th largest transnational crime. It's very complex. It's very challenging for law enforcement to deal with. There are inadequate national laws or inadequate laws at every level, typically, and they really have to focus on capacity building to deal with those challenges. There's work with local, national, and international authorities, and a focus on strategic enforcement areas like airports and ports, freight, border posts, key markets, and identification of the key stakeholders, which are typically non-governmental organizations, transporters, producers, suppliers, and consumers. And there are some products of the wildlife trade and wildlife crime on the slide. What we're going to look at today is a little bit more of an expanded view, because most of the harms that impact wildlife are actually legal. When we think about why are certain behaviors codified into law and made illegal and then regulated and enforced, it is because the behavior is harmful. However, when we look at the picture with non-human animals, their legal status typically is property under the law. There are groups that are trying to shift that, but typically that is how animals are seen in the law. And the commodification and exploitation for human use of animals coincides with violent, legal, and illegal acts that are committed against them. And this is what really shapes the nature of wildlife protection and of human-wildlife interaction. And the result of that is the victimization of billions of sentient beings by humans who view them as something rather than someone. So some major threats that harm wildlife, of course, include the climate crisis and associated harms of ocean acidification and pollution. And some of the biggest threats against wildlife are overexploitation and agricultural activity. Overexploitation can include logging, hunting, fishing, poaching, trafficking, and agriculture like crop farming, animal agriculture, deforestation, timber plantations, pesticide use, aquaculture. I do refer to some studies in this slide deck, and all of the citations are listed so that you can look at them further if you would like to. When we talk about conceptions of crime and justice, I want to talk about semiology, which is a social harm-based approach to crime and justice. And it is from the Greek word semia, to harm. And it is a branch of criminology that studies social harms that are caused by actions of nation states and corporate systems rather than more individual-based harms. And advocates for semiology as an independent field of study, even separate from criminology, studies the harms that affect marginalized individual lives and that are not typically considered to be criminal or rarely criminalized. We can assess individual and systematic harm by asking questions like, is the activity legal or illegal? Is it sustainable or not sustainable? Is it for subsistence or for market? For livelihood or profit? Is it small scale? Is it large scale? These are the questions we can ask. And within the field of criminology, there is a sub area, green criminology, that looks at environmental and animal issues, and it expands this traditional kind of viewpoint that's anthropocentric in criminology, sort of the idea of it's just an animal, right? Not so important, which is changing and shifting. There's also a promotion of a specific wildlife criminology, and it acknowledges that crimes committed by humans do not only cause human suffering. In fact, Nurse and Wyatt, two criminologists, just came out with a book on wildlife criminology just last month. When we look at shifts and concepts of harm and crime toward non-human animals and develop criminological thinking and the importance of understanding law and order discourse, we can recognize that victimization is not restricted to human animals only. And we can study the human-caused suffering of non-human animals and the environment. And this expands a typical criminological focus on wildlife trafficking and also link violence, which is something I'm going to try to talk about a little bit more later. I have to keep moving my picture around so I can actually see my slides. When we talk about semiology and greener wildlife criminology, it enables us to really focus on crime and harm. As I said, most harmful behavior and much harmful behavior that humans perpetrate toward animals is perfectly legal. It causes the victimization of non-human animals and the environment. And most wildlife is perceived as human property for human consumption, for food or sport or entertainment. And this reflects speciesism. And I'm going to talk more about this as we go through the slides. It's a social construct about which species are either worthy of protection or not worthy of protection. And this is a typical narrative of any kind of victimhood. Some charismatic animals are deemed worthy of human attention and protection. And we can look at this as a form of othering based on human preferences. And generally, concerns of non-human animals are marginalized in public policy and in legal protection and in social harm discourse. So what I'm asking you to do is really take a look at how all oppression is connected and how systems of oppression create and reinforce and expand on each other. So violent oppressive systems expand and reinforce and create other violent oppressive systems because their root cause and purpose or function is essentially the same. And that is to reinforce a mindset of fabricated social status hierarchy, like that picture on the first slide. So regardless of who the violence is perpetrated against, whether it's humans, animals, or the environment, the effect is the same. And this fabricated hierarchy is then knowingly and unknowingly applied to justify oppression. And it impacts every area of our lives and our social institutions, and including those that create laws and social policies that allow some groups to prosper and other groups to be victimized. And this theoretical lens can help us understand and examine these connections of oppression. So when we talk about semiology, we can also talk about some other concepts that we will go over today, like structural and cultural violence and intersectional theory, and also humane pedagogy. So quickly, I'm not going to go through all of these slides in detail, but I just want to introduce some of the concepts that are relevant to understanding, where I'm going with this talk. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She's a scholar and an attorney and a civil rights advocate. And intersectionality looks at the overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression and domination and discrimination. And it holds that classical conceptualizations of oppression within a society, like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, or speciesism, what we're going to talk about a little bit more, do not act independently of each other, that they interrelate and create a system of oppression that reflects these multiple forms of discrimination. And all of these conceptualizations, keep in mind, are socially created to categorize sentient beings based on race or gender or animality or class, etc. And it's used to categorically value or devalue each other and essentially create a story that the human brain can make sense of. The human brain loves stories. So we can make sense of the world. And these stories, I argue, need to be challenged and rewritten in order to benefit all of us. This is connected to structural violence, and this refers to the invisible form of violence where social structures or institutions harm humans, and in this case, I am talking about non-human animals as well, by preventing them their basic needs. And it affects humans and non-human animals differently, dependent on their social status, and it's closely linked to social justice. So avoidable violence and limitations that society place on low status groups that constrains them from achieving a quality of life that could have otherwise been possible for them. And it is caused by human decisions rather than natural causes, and can also be corrected by human decisions. It's related to cultural violence, and this is an aspect of culture that's used to justify or make direct and structural violence feel legitimate. So this can be through religion and ideology, language and art, empirical science, formal science, education, and it makes direct and structural violence look or feel okay, right? At least not wrong. And it highlights ways that acts of direct and structural violence are legitimate and made acceptable in society. When we look at speciesism, it's part of this human story of animality and worth. And it denotes discrimination based on species membership and involves treating members of one species as morally more important than members of other species. And of course, the assumption of human superiority leading to the commodification and exploitation of animals. Different animals will be considered in different ways, typically depending on their relationship to humans. So think of companion animals, right? We have more laws and protection for companion animals, although not strong laws in that case either. The idea of speciesism is also connected to, sorry, if you can see that, anthropocentrism, which is the belief that humans are the most important entity. And it interprets or regards the world in terms of human values and experiences. And this is a major concept in the fields of environmental and animal ethics and philosophy. So again, I'm sorry that I'm moving this image around. I hope it's not too distracting. So when we can also look at humane education and humane pedagogy. And this is a view that uses education to nurture compassion and respect for all living things and examines on these intersections of social justice issues with a focus on identifying systemic problems and solutions. So one aspect of this is to really examine what the true price or true cost of our relationship to other species impacts everyone, right? How it impacts human rights, how it impacts animal protection, how it impacts environmental stewardship. And we can ask the question, is there an alternative behavior that will cause less harm? I have put some links for humane education training on the slide as well that will be shared with you. So we're really asking, what I'm really asking is, how can we clearly see non-human animals and other humans without this story of animality? And how can we honestly examine our values around humanity's relationship to each other and non-human animals and the natural world, and ask ourselves if our values match our attitudes and our behavior? There are many interrelated topics in animal protection that we can apply these ideas to, and I've listed them here, but of course today we're going to talk about wildlife and social harms and impacts on wildlife. I put in some tools that I use to help explore our attitudes and relationships to non-human animals, which I won't show you today, but I will try to actually I wanted to try to move the box so that you could see all the photos. But there are lots of ways that we're indoctrinated into thinking about our uses for other animals, and it usually starts from a young age. We have a very kind of schizophrenic relationship in our ideas about how we should treat other animals. In some of these photos on this slide, we can see perspectives. And I shared another video that you can access later if you'd like to. And really asking, what would it look like if non-human animals had power over human animals, in examples of animal testing or fashion, trophy hunting, zoos, and also consumption. And we can be curious about where our own attitudes toward non-human animals lie on this continuum of use or respect, and we can explore our own attitudes and ask how we view them. Do we see other animals or experience them as food or other products for our consumption, or as sentient beings that deserve our respect and care? Do we believe that our status as humans entitles us to participate in the suffering of other animals? And we can ask, where do these beliefs originate from? And if they're helpful or harmful toward creating a more humane lifestyle and a kinder world. And would it benefit us and others, human and non-human, to shift our attitudes and beliefs and behaviors, and how? And these attitudes and actions of kindness and respect and compassion expands and reinforces each other, just as systems of violence and oppression do. Let's see if I can try to move it now. It doesn't want to move. So when we try to understand harmful attitudes and beliefs, we can look at the human need to differentiate ourselves from other animals. I'm going to move this up a little bit. T.J. Kasperbauer wrote a book called Subhuman, which studies the moral psychology of human attitudes towards animals and looks at animals and their role as a contrast class for humans and the dehumanization process, and reminds us that dehumanization and this idea of animality has been used throughout history to justify cruel treatment of certain groups. For example, Nazis were compared Jews to rats, and Black American slaves were compared to apes. And we can understand human psychological thought and attitudes toward animals when we look at how animal comparisons are used to demean other human beings by identifying them as non-human and labeling them as inferior. When we are trying to understand these harmful attitudes and beliefs, we can understand that people typically differentiate themselves from other animals. This helps us to be able to exploit them and to use them in a variety of capacities, and also as a way to provide a sense of place for ourselves in a world that is above animals in this socially created hierarchy of status, where humans are always on top. When we teach children that humans are animals, they often have difficulty believing it. And this benefits all humans, regardless of where they may fall on this spectrum of privilege compared to other humans. And it can be considered an adaptive need to elevate our humanity or to justify cruel behavior, right? We have a long history of this, and think of colonialism, right? That everything is there for our use. And human moral evaluations of animals are often determined by this need. How do we understand our emotional responses to other animals? Well, emotions have been studied deeply by many researchers over prolonged periods of time, and we know that they're largely processed unconsciously, and that they also greatly impact human psychology and moral judgments and ethical behavior. And emotions are difficult to detect, they're hard to change, and they're often resistant to rational control, and really drives us to become really rigid, cognitively rigid, and defends whatever our initial reactions are or our underlying beliefs are, and not revisit them even when we have new information that's received. So our emotions around animal and human suffering are influenced by these situational factors that impact our judgments and our biases. So these unconscious cognitive experiences can be brought to the surface of our awareness, and we can examine them and how they influence our attitudes, and we can expand our critical thinking about them. How do we do this? Well, research on racist and misogynist attitudes can help us in transforming individual and systematic speciesist behavior towards animals. And we can connect these issues of social justice. I put in some authors who look at gender and race as they relate to animals, non-human animals. And this research demonstrates that moral change has many emotional and situational obstacles that are the main drivers of attitudes and beliefs. We experience cognitive dissonance when we hear information that does not coincide with our deeply ingrained beliefs that we've held, and really have to be put into situations that are very different from what we would normally experience in order to shift any kind of implicit or explicit biases and judgments that we may have. And of course, if you look at the images, how ethics and morality and values, right, are all part of shaping our attitudes. And while these emotions can be modified with effort and support, it's very difficult to do that. Typically, it involves some kind of external support, supportive family members, being around like-minded others, working with like-minded others, and even a therapist to deal with this challenge of the shifting of behaviors. And this is particularly hard when those behaviors are not shared by many, when it doesn't conform with the dominant social norms and expectations. And this is true even for people of innately high intelligence. And we find they cannot consistently control automatic emotional processes without some form of external assistance. So that self-regulation and goal setting that's needed for behavior change is also more difficult to achieve when human mental resources are depleted, which I think that is probably true for many of us, especially at this time. Let's see. Oh, sorry about that. I'm trying to go to the next slide. So I included this quote by Mark Backoff, an ethologist, who said, after 2,500 studies, it's time to declare animal sentience proven. And this highlights the obstacle of cognitive rigidity despite overwhelming evidence. So we have a lot of information to let us know that from science that animals do experience a wide variety of emotions, ranging from joy and happiness to deep sadness and grief and post-traumatic stress disorder, empathy, jealousy, resentment. In fact, in July 2012, the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness was publicly proclaimed that this is the case. And the truth is, we really barely know that much about the human brain, let alone the brains of other species. So we should probably use the precautionary principle and err on the side of caution in terms of harming other species, since we know so very little. So these species' beliefs impact laws and enforcement, and of course, laws impact beliefs and behavior. So as I said, we focus typically on regulation of human use of other species rather than on true protection of other species. And the law simultaneously reflects and shapes human moral attitudes and behavior. It's a dynamic relationship. So the law impacts our behavior, and our attitudes and behavior impact the law. And here's where lie hope and possibility in this realm. When we look at harms that impact wildlife, we look at them and tend to look at them as normal, natural, and necessary. Right? We're indoctrinated into believing that this is the way that it has to be. I provided a link to the work of Melanie Joy, who's a Harvard-trained psychologist who really looks at this. And today we're going to just keep this in mind as we look at some specific harms involving wildlife, including the global wildlife trade and legal institutionalized forms of violence against wildlife and human-wildlife conflict and animal agriculture, wildlife killing contests, and of course, public health. There's more to talk about, but not enough time to talk about it. So when we look at the global wildlife trade, and there are victims to the global wildlife trade on this slide, it is worth billions annually. The US is the largest importer of wildlife and wildlife products, and there are significant risks to wildlife worldwide due to extinction and spread of disease, introduction of invasive species into delicate ecosystems. This trade fuels the exotic pet industry, and there's an endless array of products for human consumption, ranging from bushmeat, the meat of wild mammals like apes and monkeys, to fashion, fur and skins, and medicine. That photo is a picture of a bear that is a victim of the bear bile industry that is used for traditional medicines. When we look at institutionalized legal violence against wildlife, we can look at vivisection, experimentation, hunting, including trophy and canned hunting, fishing and trapping, and killing as part of wildlife management and conservation programs. Again, fur farms, skins for the fashion industry, entertainment, which could include wildlife killing contests, and stocking zoos and circuses and aquariums, and exotic pet keeping. Of course, also wild animal body or body part uses. The legal wildlife trade enables the illegal wildlife trade. It provides cover to an unlawful trade. This is always the case when you have a legal trade. and an illegal trade, and millions of live animals enter the US every year without any disease screening for consumption, biomedical research, pets, and along with countless pathogens and zoonotic diseases that maximize public health risks. And this is not unique to the US, of course, it is a global problem, as we well now know. And permitting any kind of legal trade creates channels of wildlife commerce that make it difficult for consumers and authorities to distinguish between legal and illegal shipments and transactions. There's also a lot of legal loopholes through which illicit wildlife trafficking operates and exists in the channels of commerce that connect supply and demand. And we have a kind of schizophrenic government response to this. We can invest in sting operations to root out smuggling to places like China and Vietnam, but then grant permits to import trophies, such as trophy hunter Corey Knowlton, who carried a black rhino carcass home from Namibia. And it reinforces this market perception that animals are worth more dead than alive. This is a very powerful photo by a wildlife photographer, Jabruson in Kenya. And the quote says, "Every day animals are bought and sold as easily as a cup of coffee or a pair of jeans." And this is the face of one of those animals in a powerful photo. And it's another sad example of humans and wild animals clashing over dwindling resources. When human issues are not taken care of, when humans are not getting what they need, animals will suffer as well, and usually more. We talked about trafficking as a typical focus of wildlife crime and how it is one of the largest criminal industries with repeated links to terrorism, and how it makes the legal trafficking and illegal trafficking harder to detect. I just wanted to say a word about pangolins. I think a lot of people have heard of the pangolin now. I know typically when I talk about pangolins, most people don't know what a pangolin is, but it is the most trafficked mammal in the world and used for scales and meat in traditional medicine and luxury food items in the pet trade. And they're trafficked in such high numbers that they are measured by the ton. And in that photo above on the top is pictures of confiscated pangolins, and then on the bottom is a pangolin with her baby. All evidence points to so far that the COVID pandemic was caused by a virus that jumped from a bat to a pangolin to a human. I want to just mention link violence. And link violence is the connection between animal abuse and other forms of violence. So there's typically a focus on companion animals, so where we could look at how animal abuse is connected with child abuse and neglect and domestic violence and also elder abuse. And it's not considered as isolated incidents, right? We can look at how they work together. Cruelty is cruelty. And it is being taken more and more seriously in criminology. And it is also the most basic form of the progression hypothesis that link between non-human animal abuse and interhuman violence. I just wanted to mention there was a recent wildlife case where Kurt Duncan pled not guilty to 125 misdemeanor charges and possible jail time. He was accused of poaching wolves, eagles, and other animals in Michigan, and he told officers that he killed the animals because he could and because he likes to do it. So when we look at link violence in all animals, we can question some of the things that we view as natural, normal, and necessary. Mark Beckoff asks if trophy hunting should be called trophy murder. Piers Byrne is a criminologist who talks about speciesism and the underlying legal definition of murder that excludes non-humans in his book, Murdering Animals, and suggests that there should be language and a term to describe the murder of animals by humans. I want to talk about, when we talk about link violence, there are connections between slaughterhouses and violent crime. And research on slaughterhouse communities have established a correlation between employment in these facilities and violent crime. The location of slaughterhouses have been associated with increases in total arrests, rates and also arrests for rape and offenses against the family in comparison to counties without a slaughterhouse. And it's additional support for the relationship between the violence of killing non-human animals and violence toward humans. Of course, there's a long history of that, and the images can show an older photo and a more modern photo as the industry has become more and more efficient. When we look at the social harms of animal agriculture, we can look at the impacts on humans, animals, and the environment. And in terms of animals, just a few facts here, that 9 billion farmed land animals are slaughtered for food each year in the US. And 300 million unwanted male chicks are killed by the US egg industry each year. There are 0 federal laws that protect animals on factory farms. There are environmental harms too. More than 2/3 of land use on the Amazon is for cattle grazing. It takes a lot of water to produce beef, for example. And most of the grain that we grow in the US is fed to farmed animals. There are mental health and physical health impacts on workers, which I think we've all seen a lot of in the news recently, including non-documented immigrants and unreported crimes committed against them in the workplace. There's a large amount of antibiotic use in animals that is passed on to consumers. Palm oil, which is also problematic, is destroying old growth forest habitats and is in the feed of animals. In animal agriculture, it's used in the feed. Of course, this contributes to hunger. There's inefficient methods of growing crops to feed to animals who are then slaughtered for consumption rather than consuming the crops without the animal as the middleman. And I just want to mention there's a specific impact on wolves. Wolves are often targeted by animal agriculture for attacking livestock. And when you kill wolves, it makes the problem worse because they can't pack hunt and they have to solo hunt, which they then turn to attacking more vulnerable livestock instead of their typical targets for hunting. When we look at animal agriculture and the law, we could see how the law works to protect the industry and not really protect any of these harms against humans, animals, or the environment. This is really due to the slippery slope argument. They're a very powerful industry and they lobby against all laws to protect any animals, including companion animals. And the laws that protect the industry are instead lobbied for, such as ag-gag bills that make it difficult or impossible for whistleblowing employees or animal advocacy groups to expose any kind of animal cruelty or safety issues. I linked to an article by Harari who says that concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which they're also known as one of the worst crimes in history. And that what makes the existence of domesticated farm animals particularly cruel is not just the way in which they die, but above all, how they live and some of the methods that are used in the industry, like gestation crates for pigs and debeaking, etc. These are all standard industry practice, and they are by making those acts legal. I did include some animal agriculture resources if you're interested in looking at that topic more to be able to take action around some of those issues that I discussed. I wanted to also bring up wildlife killing contests. I feel like that's something that people aren't very aware of. They are organized events and it's legal in 45 states where participants compete for prizes, typically cash or hunting equipment, for killing the most and our largest animals within a specific time period. And animals that are commonly targeted in those contests include bobcats, coyotes, foxes, prairie dogs, rabbits, raccoons, squirrels, woodchucks, and in some Western states, mountain lions and wolves. Of course, many of you on here, I'm sure know that gray wolves were protected under the Endangered Species Act. for almost 50 years after they were hunted to the brink of extinction, are now being trophy hunted in several states. So I did include some more information and action alerts about wildlife killing contests. When we look at laws and the regulation and enforcement of laws and the consumer demand for some of these products, we can look at federal, national, and local laws. And we can also look at training for officers who deal with some of these issues, and also problems of corruption. There's a lot of corruption involved in the enforcement of these laws globally. And unless we do something to reduce the demand and help the humans that are using some of these products in some places, or change and shift our attitudes about them, it is something that will likely not be solved. I wanted to say a word about the pandemic. This quote is from an article that was written in May 2020. And it said, the bottom line is, when nature is sick, we're sick. In May 2019, the UN Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services announced that 1 million land-based freshwater and marine species are at risk of extinction because of human activity in the past 50 years. And 1 year later, in this National Geographic article by Rachel Bow, refers to that report and makes the connection between the human assault on nature and COVID-19, as did many others. She wrote, the pandemic is a result of humankind's destruction of the planet, rampant deforestation, uncontrolled expansion of agriculture, intensive farming, mining, and infrastructure development. So this exploitation of wild species have created a perfect storm for the spillover of diseases from wildlife to people. And that future pandemics will happen more frequently, will kill more people, and will cause greater economic damage unless we start recognizing the links between human health and the health of the planet, its ecosystems, and non-human living creatures. So this is not radical, and she talks about the One Health framework recognized by the CDC and the World Health Organization and governments around the world. So something I wanted to just mention about the One Health model, it is a triad looking at how we can keep people healthy, animals healthy, and the environment healthy. And again, you will have these slides if you want to look at them more. I just wanted to mention something about the EcoHealth Alliance, which follows the One Health model and does work in wildlife conservation and pandemic prevention and deforestation. And recently, NIH terminated their research. So they had years of ongoing research that were terminated, and it was coronavirus research that was funded. So I want to talk a little bit now about shifting attitudes and laws regarding non-human animals and the benefits for humans. I just put some quotes on here that I always love, and the Gandhi quote, the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. And Jane Goodall, who's pictured here, said we should have respect for all animals because it makes better human beings of us all. Henry Beston, who's a naturalist writer, wrote in 1928, we need another and wiser and perhaps more mystical concept of animals. For animals shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. So when we look at solutions, what can we do? So the title of this slide is Value Nature, Not Stuff. We can live consciously. We can think about what we eat, what we buy, throw away, the energy we consume, and the systems that we support with our dollars. We can stay informed, we can think critically, and we can understand how our behavior impacts the world, and we can pressure systems with our consumer choices. And we have to get involved politically. If you care about these issues, it's very important. And we have to give and get support from like-minded people and groups. Of course, intelligent creative design and innovation exists and will keep evolving. And we can take the challenge to find solutions to the problems that are caused by interrelated harms. And we can also support organizations that are working to protect wildlife, like the Wolf Conservation Center, I just noticed a typo there, the EcoHealth Alliance, et cetera, and we can contribute to fundraising. And we also can acquire and apply our own skills and passions to contribute to helping to the problem as a volunteer or even as a career. And the United Nations Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services said, in order to safeguard a healthy planet, society needs to shift from a sole focus on chasing economic growth. One of the main things that I just want to drive home is that animal protection is a social justice issue, and it is connected and intersected with all social justice issues. Paul Farmer, the anthropologist and physician, said the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong in the world. Margaret Mead also reminds us that we should never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, that is the only thing that ever has. And while we have the privilege to know these things, Einstein reminds us we also have the duty to act. I shared a link to a video. It's called Be a Hummingbird, and it's Wangari Maathai, who is an activist and founder of the Greenbelt movement. She was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's a little clip of her talking about how we can all do whatever we can do to make things improve. And we can include animals in our social justice discourse. I included a quote here. The reason I dedicate myself to helping animals so much is that there are already so many people dedicated to hurting them. So I just wanted to try to end on a hopeful note that the world will change if we do. We make up the world. All life matters when we want to create a just, healthy, and equitable and sustainable world. It's an illusion that we're disconnected from each other or other species in our environment. We are all intricately connected. And I think the events of the world recently have really highlighted that. And when we connect the disconnect and we cultivate empathy and compassion for all beings, especially those that we are indoctrinated into disregarding or using or disliking or consuming, that we will move toward creating a truly equitable, healthy, sustainable, and safe world for us all. Some final thoughts. There's a lot going on in this slide, but it is from an organization called Animal Wellness Action, who points out that when people with hostile views toward animal protection are in public office, they're a threat to animals and also the health of our society. We know that animal cruelty is bound up with other social ills, and we need organizations that can study the records of candidates and issue recommendations based on their animal protection performances and pledges. So we have a race for president coming soon. And Animal Wellness Action will be publishing analysis of the records of Biden and Trump to inform the public. And it's also essential that we remind people running for office that we do care about these issues and that politicians really need to step up their game on animal protection to get votes. So AWA launched petitions to both candidates demanding they address these issues with more transparency and in a more meaningful way. So far, Biden or Trump has not set forth their vision for animal protection, and it's not widely discussed in political campaigns. And it is probably one of the most underestimated issues in American politics. And many people do care about this, and it does not attract the attention it deserves from politicians. So we can make 2020 the year that brings in an era of peace and respect for all life. You can sign the petitions that I included links to that urge the presidential candidates to articulate their views on animal protection for us to hear and to heed. And other sources I included are the Humane Society Legislative Fund, and also locally in New York City, where I am, we have Voters for Animal Rights, which is an organization that helps us understand the views and support of local politicians. So the truth is that for all interconnected social justice issues, including animal protection, that without laws, we cannot stop cruelty, and without good lawmakers, we cannot hope to enact those laws. And of course, this year has brought us unprecedented environmental disasters, a global pandemic, and more tragedy, along with loud opposition to a long history of racial oppression. We can also make 2020 the year that brings in an era of peace and respect for all life. If you'd like to stay in touch with me, of course, I'll be here for questions and answers. My email is also on this slide, and I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Kim, thank you so much. This is all really great information, and I can tell you just so many of the questions aren't questions at all, but just words of gratitude for leading this discussion and for having so much information and so many resources. So first of all, before we go ahead with questions, for those of you who joined after our introduction, we are here with Dr. Kim Spanjol, who just finished her talk on wild crimes, the exploitation of our world's most vulnerable animals. And actually the talk was much more than that. And also a lot of the questions are people asking for, will I be able to see this presentation? Could you send it to me? What about these links? And so for everybody, we are recording this, and we will have it up on the Wolf Conservation Center website, and we will ask him for any links to include in that page as well. So there'll be plenty of resources so people can further explore. There are a lot of questions, so let's get started. Let's see. First one, have there been any significant advances legislatively that could really help, foster some protections for some of these animals or end some of these practices you've discussed?
Sure, yeah, of course. This work has been going on for a long time, and we do have laws, on the federal level and local levels, to help protect animals. While we have those laws in place, and while sometimes those laws change and are rolled back, in fact, Maggie and I were talking right before the webinar about some of the rollbacks on legislation to protect animals in Alaska on wildlife preserves like wolves and bears and predators, and allowing some hunting practices like killing wolves in their dens and luring wildlife and aerial shooting of wildlife and things like that. So it's always a couple of steps forward, a few steps backward. It keeps kind of moving, but you have to be persistent. The other thing that I wanted to just say is that when we look at some of the ways that we view the world and how we view animals primarily as something that we can regulate our use of, that's going to be inherent in a lot of the laws that are created and enforced. And we really need to start looking at the whole picture, the interconnection between practices that harm people and harm the environment and harm animals, and how we can address holistic laws and holistic procedures and policies and practices that address all of those needs and really see animals as worthy of protection in and of themselves, without the connection to human use and need. I hope that answers that question.
No, it's a really good point. Here's another. Someone who's curious about the distinction between wild and domestic animals. After all, as animals like the pangolin are raised on farms, but sold as, quote, wildlife in wet markets, these distinctions can become a bit fuzzy.
Mhm.
So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also a move where, wild animals are being farmed and expanded. In South Africa, they're expanding what kinds of animals can be domesticated and farmed and used for consumption. So again, we can, while the line is fuzzy, it always kind of goes back to that idea that, you know, things for animals, laws that protect animals are always going to be in view with how humans want to exploit them and commodify them, right? And that's what's happening with wildlife that's being farmed and marketed for use as well. The line is fuzzy, and I think you could tell from my presentation that I think that we need stronger laws and enforcement of laws to protect all animals, companion animals, wildlife, um, farmed wildlife, and also, animals that we domesticate and farm here, more in the U.S. So the line is fuzzy, and I think that we need to really look at how we can structure our laws and protection of animals, in all ways.
Definitely. All right, someone's asking, have there been surveys to show what the opinion of the general public, not industrial lobbies, is regarding wildlife conservation or strengthening laws to prevent cruelty to animals?
Uh, yeah, the public I will try, I didn't link to any in my presentation, but I'll certainly try to find some. Again, like I mentioned, these issues are a concern to the public. It's also a bipartisan concern. So it's something that, regardless of, people's political persuasions, it's an issue that most people care about, and most people want to see, laws that protect wildlife. Certainly that's something that we need to let politicians and elected officials know. And that's why it's so important to have a voice, to use our voice and to vote and to veto, so that we can let them know what we want and hold them accountable to that. If we rely on lobbyists from different industries to do that, and people aren't involved in our democracy, then that is what the laws will be. So we need to be using our voice and our power to make those shifts that really reflect what most people do want.
Yep, we definitely do. This is interesting too. Are there any societies or countries that do better than others protecting animal rights? And if so, how do they achieve that?
That is a really good question. I would say that it's probably something that we could look at on a case-by-case basis, because I think that in every country you'll find some species are more protected than other species, and I think that a lot of that depends again on human need and the human commodification of those species. So while, off the top of my head, I can't really say that there's any countries that really stand out to me more than others. That's a conversation I'd love to have further with more people. I think that there are practices and successes in certain countries that can be modeled from. This is certainly an area where many people are working very hard all over the world to make positive changes in. So something to look at further.
Mm-hmm. How do your students, is this usually the first time they're having or learning about these sorts of issues or laws or definitions when you see them at the college level, or is this brand new to them?
I mean, I think for the most part, it's new to them. It's new to them to view animal protection as a social justice issue. It's new for them to understand that we have biases and prejudices when it comes to other species that shape all of our institutions and our laws. So I think that when people start connecting those issues, they really understand that when social harms are perpetrated against humans, animals, or the environment, that they are connected and they have to look at everything holistically. And I think often they have not. They've often looked at all of these issues individually instead of how they all work together. So the feedback that I've gotten is that it is usually the first time that they've really explored the issues in this way.
Sorry about that, I was muted. Let's see, again, a lot of people just saying thank you. Really, really great feedback. So thank you, Kim. Let's see. What about the link between correction officers, police, other prison workers, and violent crime in their own homes and communities?
And the connection between violence against humans and
yeah, I guess human and non-human animals.
I mean, there's so much that I can say about that. You know, one of the things that and I hope this will answer the question, but one of the things that I do, and I work with animals in my therapy practice and in my consultation, and myself and some other colleagues that I work with, we have worked on prison animal programs, for example. I don't know how familiar people are with that, but that's common. It's in every state where incarcerated individuals will work with animals, typically dogs, and kind of develop different kinds of relationships and interactions and views working with these animals to kind of combat some of the violence and the trauma. And we are also looking at how we can work with law enforcement in that way as well, and to really work with the human-animal bond to kind of understand systems of violence that maybe are hidden, that we don't really see or acknowledge, and how when we honor that bond with other animals and nature, that we can actually shift our behavior and shift our understanding of the world and shift the way that we interact with each other. So that's part of the work that I do. And there are amazing transformations that can happen. You have to kind of get past a lot of the cognitive dissonance at first. This is sort of related to the question you asked before, but I've had students yell at me in my classes because they are really confronted by a lot of the things that they learn about and see, and they don't like to see themselves as being part of those violent, oppressive systems. And when they do, it can be difficult, but it's also an opportunity to make a choice about it. Because, again, I'm not trying to indoctrinate anyone into my way of thinking or how I understand these ideas, but I do feel like we need to have a choice about it. And if we don't bring these issues to light and understand that these are interconnected systems of violence that we are part of and we also perpetrate, then we can't make any decisions about how we want to go forward. So I think, just bringing the awareness there is an important first step, because I think that overall we are blind to that. All of us, we all hurt other people and animals and the environment in some way, in our modern life. And we can really also focus on how can we reduce that harm. And that is true in our criminal justice system, and our educational systems and our healthcare systems. So, that's part of the work that I try to do and I dedicated myself to.
And we appreciate that. Thank you, Kim. There's a question about, I'm going to try to just shorten it a bit. If you know of any efforts to put humane education in early curriculum, so children are not are thinking of themselves as a part of nature and not separate from it.
Yes, and I actually I included some organizations in the slide deck so people can have access to that. There is a lot of work on bringing humane education to students of all ages, particularly younger students, and that includes the Academy of Pro-Social Learning, the Institute for Humane Education. So I linked to that. And also, we're looking at how do we include that more in higher education, because higher education and college populations are interesting to work with. I've worked with people of all ages, and I've worked in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools and colleges, and it's really interesting because of while a lot of the attention is focused on the younger students, which is of course important at every age, but it's interesting because when you work with college age students, it's really the first time in their life that they really can act on, some of their preferences that they might discover when they start thinking about their values and if their values are aligned with their behavior. So when you work with younger students, they may want to do things differently, but they often can. But when you work with college age students, they actually have the agency and ability to do that. So it's really interesting to see some of the transformations that have occurred in my experience. It's hopeful. And I think when you do this kind of work, you really need to be hopeful.
100%. So we appreciate you sharing that. And just, I guess as a last question, I'm going to try to condense this one as well, but just finding when you're trying to raise awareness or raise awareness for some of these crimes, whether they're legal or not, and using the photos with the information without scaring people away. Is there a balance that you could recommend where you could try to inspire people to care or change their behavior or take action without just making them run away with nightmares?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. These are all really good questions. I hope I'm doing them justice by answering them the way that I am. There's a lot of research on that. How much do you share? How much do you show? I probably didn't do a great job myself today. In fact, when I was going over this webinar with a friend, she encouraged me. She said, "You're not putting enough images that are really going to get people, upset or, catch their attention." And so I did add some. And I think there has to be a balance. Again, there is research on this subject, right? You want to show people enough so that they understand the severity of the problem, and you don't want to show them so much that they become apathetic and feel helpless. So I try to balance that as much as I can. And I'm still working on it. I rely on feedback from my students. I'll rely on feedback from this webinar to help me strike a balance, because I think when you know the urgency of these issues, I certainly am tempted, especially with my older students or adults, to really throw a lot at them. And of course, there's a danger in that. You don't want to show them too much, but, and make them not, even try. But at the same time, I think that, it's important to show the reality of what's going on, because animals do need our help. They need us badly. And that's something that I hope I communicated in this webinar. They need us to act.
No, you have, and they can't vote, so they need us to do it for them.
Okay, exactly.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. We have covered a lot of questions, and I know that there's just so many things that we could talk about. So thank you so much again for being here, and for everyone. Again, we are going to post a copy of a recording of this presentation on our website, so you can share it, you can review it. We'll include some other resources as well. Is there anything else you want to add, Kim, before we wrap things up?
The only thing I would like to say is thank you so much for inviting me. And I will be honest with you, I really like to do public talks. That's not the kind of person I am. Typically, but I also feel like this message is really important, so I force myself. So I hope that the message was communicated in a way that everyone could hear, and that if you would like to stay in touch with me, I'd be more than happy to do that and support you in your own journey to help animals and to really understand that those interconnections of social justice. If we really want to have a better world for humans, we need to pay attention to having a better world for other animals in the environment as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you again. And for everyone else, thank you as well for joining us and all of your excellent questions. Again, you can learn more about all of this in a couple of days. We'll hustle to get up on our website as soon as possible. And you can learn more about the Wolf Conservation Center, of course, via that same website. Also, our scientific webinar series and the 42 wolves who currently call the center home. Our website is www.nywolf.org. And we will be having part 2 of our kind of wild crime series. It will be next month. So please stay tuned. We will post more information about that. It'll be a discussion with Professor Mary Ting. So again, Kim, thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for joining us tonight. And hopefully we'll get an update from you soon and we'll be moving in a good direction.
Yeah, thank you for all the work that you do at Wolf Conservation Center too.
Aw, thanks, Kim. All right, good night, everybody.